To the Australian election campaign, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has officially launched Labor's bid in Perth. Liberal leader Peter Dutton spent the weekend rallying supporters in Sydney, both parties announcing substantial housing initiatives aimed at easing affordability for first-time buyers. Labor pledging to construct 100,000 new homes and an offer of a 5% deposit scheme. Albanese focused on tackling rising living costs and highlighted improvements in real wages and housing accessibility, contrasting his government's achievements with the coalition's past policies as the campaign now heats up. Both parties aiming to address the pressing concerns of voters right across the nation. It seems like housing, Tim Harcourt, is the number one thing both parties are focused on. Why is that?
Look, I think it's the last election of, baby boomer largesse in a way, Aaron, with lots of spending. There is clearly an issue that younger people have been locked out of the housing market, particularly in our more expensive capital cities. It's a big election issue. Both parties have had their issues with inner city seats, with Teals and Greens losing their primary vote. And clearly, younger people are really worried about getting into the property market, and both parties really have to address that, at least in terms of showcasing policies and eventually in terms of substance.
I feel like one thing we've learned from the COVID experience is nothing's for free. And when governments talk about giving you something, you know that it won't be long until there's a policy that they're not going to announce at the election, that they'll take something away. And something really interesting I've noticed, I don't know about you, there's equally as many people talking about the cost of all of this as there are talking about the policies themselves. And usually the coalition are the Conservatives. They don't want to spend, they want to cut. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening during this election campaign. What's your view on that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think both parties have been in an auction to give stuff away. And of course, you don't give it away. It's not free. I mean, a good example, Aaron, is free university. As soon as the US Democrats said that, we'll cut student tuition, abolish it, the Labor Party tried to do it too, with a bit of pressure from the Greens. But of course, university is not free, and if students don't pay for it or their parents don't pay for it, then the bus drivers and factory workers and everyone else has to pay for it. So, in some ways, we've moved away from the principles of the Hawke-Keating government, which is that you pay through HECS, you pay after you graduate for something that you personally benefit from, instead of putting it on all the blue-collar workers and all the other people that don't get the benefit of university education.
Watching the news last night and watching the reaction of a bunch of economists who said this has all been tried before, it doesn't work, and it ends up in disaster. And what is essentially happening here is they're helping those who own homes more than they're helping those getting into the market, and it just will continually push up prices. Anthony Albanese has also been criticised for not building the houses that he said he would in his first term. Hasn't happened. And I guess the question is, in a free market like we have, why is the government getting involved in housing?
Well, I guess the government doesn't want to do the really hard work, and that's looking at negative gearing and looking at some of those taxation arrangements. And you saw that Bill Shorten was really burnt by some of those types of policies.
They're not getting into that again, are they?
No, they're very scared about that. So they're trying to say, all right, well, we'll look at housing supply and we'll build more homes. And a lot of that's the state government, responsibility. Of course, Chris Minns has been very proactive on that in New South Wales. But at the end of the day, supply means development, and there's a lot of councils that are run by the Greens and inner city left who don't want development. So in some ways, the Greens are the champions of the young people wanting to buy a house, but their councils, or their Greens-led councils, are in the way of that. So there's a great paradox in how we approach housing in Australia.
But I think, look, obviously 10, 15 years ago, there was a decision that instead of increasing taxes, instead of cutting services, which were electoral poison for both parties, they would both agree on something, which was growth. Population growth has been the key. And the challenge with that, it's not just housing, it's the services for those houses. I look at Victoria, where the Labor Premier has been announcing an increase in height restrictions so that you can have 6-storey apartment blocks and townhouses developments in leafy suburbs like Brighton, for example, and people are up in arms. The issue becomes hospitals, the issue becomes schools, the issue becomes public transport, which are really expensive. And the governments don't really want to have to do it, and they seem to build it when it's too late. That's become the story of Australian growth, isn't it?
Well, it has, and also there's the factor of immigration. You know, during COVID we had no immigration. It was very different in Australia, and then it roared back pretty quickly, and that means there's demand for housing and education and hospitals. And a lot of our growth and a lot of our economic success is founded on high levels of immigration, but it seems that there are environmental and infrastructure difficulties at the rate of growth. I don't think anyone says there should be no immigration, but the rate of growth and the rate of pace seems to be an election issue, and that's where housing's sort of been tied up in a lot of that controversy we've seen at the election campaign.
I just want to finish with this, because I look at Australia and we have the same capital cities that we had 100 years ago, and regional areas. There is so much potential for population growth. Areas like Newcastle, Wollongong, Ballarat, Geelong would be dying for government projects and for more people, particularly for businesses as well. But Melbourne and Sydney seem to be where people generally want to live. Is that something that should have been dealt with a long time ago?
Music to my ears, Aaron. I mean, my grandfather, who lived in regional Victoria, worked for Ben Chifley, the Labor Prime Minister in the war, and it was all about decentralisation and growing the regions. And Bill Kelty also did a very important report for Bill Kelty, for Paul Keating on this. Yeah, look, it's partly the fact that when people immigrate, they want to be in the bigger cities, they want to be where their communities are. The regions now are seeing, you know, some sea change and tree change and cool change if, you know, people want to go down to Ballarat and Tassie as the planet warms up. So we are seeing some factor of that, but certainly infrastructure projects would help. And even, you know, the smaller capital cities of you know, Adelaide and Hobart could benefit with infrastructure projects like the Adelaide Oval redevelopment and the hospitals, and in Hobart with their new stadium. So I think to some degree governments are thinking about the regions and also the smaller capital cities, because Australia's not just about Sydney and Melbourne, believe it or not.
No, and Sydney and Melbourne have become almost unlivable because of the amount of development that has to happen to maintain the population growth. When you're in Melbourne these days, it is really hard to get around, and has been for 10 years, and none of these projects are finished. And you think about the United States, where you drive on the East Coast and every hour you bump into a city that randomly gets bigger than the next. And while I understand this kind of big arid space in the middle, the US has that too, but they have cities where people live and grow and develop businesses as well. And I just wonder whether that focus on Sydney and Melbourne for population growth is helping or hindering. Always appreciate your insights. Of course, Tim Harcourt, host of the Airport Economist channel and professor there at UTS in Sydney. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Aaron. Good to be with you.